So we're continuing in this summer journey that we're taking with the Apostle Paul to learn about what the Apostle Paul has to say, because there's so much confusion about what the Apostle Paul had to say. And I have told you a couple weeks ago that I have the particular bent that we need to, as this church that's been named after this one, know enough about what he said that we might be able to embody how he interpreted what Jesus was saying to him. And I think I've forgotten to mention to you that there's some idea that Paul believed that Jesus spoke directly to him for a long period of time, like over 3 years, to tell him what it was that he was supposed to bring out for all of us to know. And so as I was thinking about it this week, I thought, we might as well just jump right off into one of the things that is the most confusing that Paul has written about in his letters. And that is a little something called the rapture, a little something called the rapture. Because in this first Thessalonians book, this book that is the first letter that Paul wrote, but is not the first in the Bible, he takes that on right from the beginning. And it's a subject that I often get asked about, but I don't necessarily always have a good explanation for. So I challenged myself this week to try and find out a little bit more about this word and this idea, because I've had kind of a long hate relationship with this concept of this rapture that we've heard so much about in the last, 20 some odd years. I'll start by telling you a little story about how this got started in my life. Now, I was raised Catholic. You all know that. I was raised Catholic. In the Catholic Church, we did not hear, at least in my Catholic Church, we did not hear the word rapture ever. Ever. It was never brought up to us. We never, ever heard it. And although I would tell you that in the Catholic Church that I grew up with, it was almost like we were serving St. Paul over serving Jesus, because we heard a lot of the epistles, we still never heard anything about this rapture where you're just going to poof and be gone to God. And so when I was younger and I was working in this dress store in Barrington, Iowa, I had no clue when this little group of ladies came into my store and started talking about how they were looking for their outfits to wear for the day of the rapture. I had no clue what they were talking about. And so that was way back in 1988. And some of you may remember that we were all supposed to be raptured on 8/8/88, right? On August 8th of 1988, all of us that were good believing Christians were supposed to be poof up in the air, and then Armageddon was going to start. I didn't know what they were talking about. But they, being the good Christian women that they were, wanted to tell me about it. And so I let them talk to me, and they kept telling me about how they were coming in to find just the right outfits to wear on Rapture Day. They were coming in to make sure that when the trumpet sounded and Jesus descended from the heavens, they would look good for Jesus to take them away. I had no clue what they were talking about, but they kept telling me. Over a period of a couple weeks, they kept talking to me about what the rapture was, because they wanted me to go with them. Right? They wanted me to be saved enough that I would go with them to heaven. And even though they were telling me, I still didn't know what the rapture really was. And so about 3 days prior to 8/8/88, the ladies had finally decided, after watching the turnaround of clothes for 2 or 3 weeks in my store, they had finally decided what their outfits were, and they came in to buy their outfits. And I particularly liked the pastor's wife, and they were very, very conservative. You have to know, they were very, very conservative, and I don't believe that I've ever been very, very conservative my entire life. And so when she came up and we're ringing up the clothes, and I'm telling you, it was a lot of money for the clothes that they were buying. We were ringing up the clothes. She said to me, "So Jana, what are you going to do on the day that the Lord comes?" I was kind of a smart aleck back then. Back then, yeah. Peanut gallery. And I said, well, you know what, I really think I'm getting a new car, because there's going to be a lot of them that seem to be abandoned. Did not go over well, let me tell you. Did not go over well. I didn't realize. I was too young and too stupid and too full of myself to realize how I had offended those ladies. They still came and bought clothing in my store, but I had offended them big time. And I think what I said became particularly offensive when the fact that 8/8/88 happened and no one was poofed into heaven. They had to live through this thought that this is what we have been told, this is what we believe, and it never came to pass. So from that point on in my life, I've always been intrigued by all of the times when people say, we're going to heaven on this day. We're going to heaven on that day. Because even not knowing much about the Bible at one point in my life, I did know that there was a scripture that said, only the Father knows when that will happen, right? I knew that enough. Only the Father knows when that's going to happen. So as I've gotten into this career of being a lifetime pastor, this subject has been something to me that I have avoided because I don't want to talk about it because it is so confusing to get into it. But did you know that since 1913, there have been 64 times when someone tried to predict that the world was going to end, and only those of us who are true believers are going to go up into the sky with God. 64 times people have tried to bring out this idea that this world has true believers in it that are going to be poofed up into the sky. That is exactly what the rapture theory is that if you are a true believer, then you're going to be lifted up first to go into heaven with God, go into that far off, way in the clouds heaven, so that you don't have to go through Armageddon. Problem with that is, that's not classic Christian doctrine. Classic Christian doctrine talks about the ascension of Jesus going back to the Father. It talks about Jesus' second coming into the world again. But it never, ever talks about this poof up into the air that developed over time. And it's not been a short period of time that this idea actually developed. This has been a long time, hundreds of years, that people have been talking about. This is how they've been explaining what this particular passage from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians is supposed to have been saying. Another problem with it is that the leading conservative theologian in the world, now, mind you, I just said the leading, that means he's top. That means when he speaks, it's like who's the guy that speaks, when somebody speaks, you listen? No, the banker. What's the banker's name? When this theologian speaks, it's like E.F. Hutton speaking. Everybody goes, huh? And they listen to him. The leading theologian who is conservative in this world, his name is N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, says, all of this energy, all of this thought process that we have put around these two tiny little verses from the book of Thessalonians is wrong. Now you'd think that a theologian who's the top conservative would affirm this rapture idea. Nope. Tom Wright says that there was absolutely no way when Paul was writing this letter to the Thessalonians that he was thinking about this idea of Christians being poofed up into the air. He says that in Britain, they kind of look at us American Christians like we're a little bit nutty because we spend so much time thinking about this idea called the rapture that we really, really need to take seriously, that what we're doing is being exclusionary when we talk about that subject. You see, Wright wants us all to understand that Paul was not writing about exclusions. Paul was using imagery from the Old Testament. Remember, Paul was a very well-educated Jewish Pharisee. He was using imagery, poetic imagery from Moses coming down from the mountain and Daniel saying that there will be a lifting up. He was using this poetic imagery to try and help us to understand that the minute that God decides in God's time that heaven and earth are going to become the same place, the minute that happens, we are going to be changed. We're going to be so lifted up. We're going to be so filled with the Spirit that we can't help but be changed. But that doesn't mean that all of us are getting on the bus and taking off over there. Because Tom Wright says that the thing we need to be concentrating on is getting heaven and earth to be the same place. The rapture only works, you see, when heaven is this far-off ideal where we want to go. Because we then believe that earth down here is such a horrible, bad place, we've got to escape it to go to the wonderful heavenly place over there. Tom Wright says it's all supposed to be the same place, that heaven is here, heaven is among us, and it's our job in the meantime, while we're waiting on the final revelation of all of us opening to see that God is already among us, that our job is in the meantime to be out there working to collapse that divide, to bring those two concepts together, that heaven is already here in the midst of us, and we are the ones who prevent that from being known. The meantime is the time when all of us have to open the eyes of our hearts and look around at what's going on. I cannot believe, it is still difficult for me to wrap my mind around the fact that while we were in the midst of this church last Sunday morning praying, Mark looked at his phone for us and told us that 50 people had died in Orlando. 50 people had been killed in Orlando. Because in the meantime, we are still busy saying it's that or it's this. In the meantime, we as Christian people are still saying it's either this or it's that. In the meantime, we are people who do not have our eyes open enough, our hearts open enough to see that the world needs us to stop worrying so much about heaven being out there and realize that heaven is right here. I was reminded at annual conference this weekend, we had the annual conference for the Illinois conference. I was reminded at annual conference this weekend of images that in my mind I know are there, but I just have not taken the time to think about them. The fact that it was just simply a year ago that the people who opened their hearts, their arms, their church to pray with someone who came through the door were killed because of hate. In the meantime, we have forgotten those sorts of things are going on. I was reminded by Tracy Blackman, who is the executive minister of justice and witness for the entire denomination of the United Church of Christ. I was reminded of Michael Brown lying on that street in Ferguson 4.5 hours with his parents behind a yellow caution line, their son lying dead in the street, and they were not allowed to touch him for 4.5 hours. I was reminded that in the meantime, we have let the ideas of Ferguson go, and we don't think about it anymore. I was reminded that there are children in this world, in the streets of America, who are starving. Literally, did you ever think when you were growing up that you would ever hear that there are children in the streets of gold who are not eating? Did you ever think that you would one day hear that in the United States of America, children are dying from starvation? Did you ever think you'd hear that? In the meantime, we've forgotten about that sort of stuff. Because you see, sometimes our eyes get so heavenward. It's there, I want the glory, I want the light. Our eyes get so heavenward, we are absolutely no earthly good. And N.T. Wright, again, I will tell you, he is the leading conservative in the world, says we've got to get our act together. And we've got to stop worrying about getting to heaven and realize that we are already in it. And it's our own actions that prevent us from seeing that. You see, in the meantime, there is so much work for us to do. In the meantime, there is so many places where our hands and our hearts and our eyes and our feet and the strength of our back and the strength of our convictions can make heaven appear here on this earth. Think about what Virginia just said to us. I thank God, Pastor, you don't know. I thank God that I could get here today. Because there is so much out there, so much hatred, so much unrest, so much violence, that there are people in this world who face that, and they don't simply have the luxury of getting to church on Sunday morning. But then again, I guess there are those who just don't get to church on Sunday morning because, I don't know, the television is more important. In the meantime, this time between when heaven and earth are fully realized together, and as Revelation says, God comes to us, in the meantime, we have so much work to do. So much work to do. Now, I want to clear up just one more thing about the rapture. I don't think that people who believe in the rapture are bad people. I don't think that they're bad Christians. I just think that they believe something differently than I do. But because they believe something differently than I do, sometimes we don't get to a place of common ground. Because we allow what we believe over here and what we believe over here to keep us apart. Perhaps maybe in the meantime, what we need to do is we need to forget about the fact that we don't agree with someone else's beliefs. And just say, how can we work together to make a difference in this world? Perhaps we need to let go of the fact that we don't believe the way that they believe, we don't worship what they worship, we don't want to do what they want to do, and walk up to them and say, how is it that we can work together? In the meantime, perhaps what we are called to do, if we are truly to be people of heaven, is to let go of those things we hold on to so deeply that keep us separated from one another. Kathleen told me a story. You want to tell the Christopher Rodkey story? Stand up. Stand up, tell that story.
Jana and I know a pastor of a UCC church in Dallastown, Pennsylvania, which is in the middle of Pennsylvania. And he went to University of Chicago Divinity School. And he placed, they have one of those signs in the front of their church where you can put letters in. And so he put, and they change that, every few weeks or every month or so. And he put a message on there that said, Happy Ramadan, or have a blessed Ramadan to our Muslim neighbors. And there are a number of Muslim people who live in this area. And he started getting, he got a phone call from someone who wouldn't leave their name, using expletives and telling the church that they were wrong and unchristian and heretics for having this sign out. And then this guy started tweeting against this sign. And this guy tagged Ann Coulter in this message, and he took a picture of the sign and put it out on his Twitter feed. And it ends up that this guy is on the school board of that area, and he's also a delegate to the Republican National Convention and supporting a candidate whose name I shall not say. And it sort of erupted into this thing, and all the newspapers getting involved and whatever. And then people are now coming out of the woodwork to support the church and to say, thank God there's someone and some people here who are reaching out to neighbors and saying, it doesn't really matter what you believe, it matters how you're living.
Right.
Is that what you want me to say?
Good job. Good job. Imagine that in the meantime, all we've got time to do is complain about the sign that someone has in their front yard, lifting up blessings for our neighbors. For our neighbors. Y'all know that Muslims share the same God with us, right? Muslims are a monotheistic religion who claim their God, whom they call Allah, as the same God we call Yahweh. Imagine that in the meantime, people who are supposed to be working for the kingdom of God to be known, having all the time in the world to take pictures of a sign, to call and cuss out people, and to post them on Twitter. What difference could have been made if the person would have walked in and said to Christopher, explain to me a little bit about why you would put that sign in the yard. I don't understand. You see, most of our differences come because we refuse to try and understand another's point of view. And many, many times in our life, what we have seen happen is that those who believe in this subject don't want to understand those who do not believe in that subject. And those who do not believe in that subject don't want to understand those who do. And in the meantime, the world is, what's the phrase, going to hell in a handbasket. You see, the meantime is this place where we are given God's grace and God's love and God's energy and God's peace and God's joy to be able to go out in this world and tell everyone that we are in the midst of God's heaven. That place where there will be no more weeping, where tears will be dried from our faces, where there will be no more gnashing of teeth, and where all will know the glory of God. You see, in the meantime, we are being filled to be emptied out of this world. Yet we spend so much time. We spend so much time worried about what's out there and forgetting what's in our midst. So I felt challenged at annual conference this week. I had forgotten, because I just allowed myself to just forget it. I had forgotten about Michael Brown. I had forgotten about Mother Emanuel Church. I had forgotten about the names of the 7 people who were killed in Chicago last week. I had forgotten about the ones that had been shot in a 24-hour period in Chicago just a month ago. I had forgotten because I simply did not take the time to see heaven here among us. And I challenge each one of you this day to let the eyes of your heart be open so wide that you see heaven too, and you let go of worrying about getting to God, because God is already here. God is in our midst. God is with us. God is, as Paul Tillich would say, the ground of our being through which we emerge. And then work for the meantime to bring about peace on earth, to bring about the heaven that all can see, to bring about the glory of God. Amen.